first became a journalist purely by accident, really. I always like to think I was pretty good at writing. But I never had any sort of qualifications that showed that. I just was a mad film buff. And in fact, when I was a teenager, I used to go to the cinema and used to sort of rather sadly, used to take little notebooks with me and scribble reviews, which I would just make notes of all the credits and all that sort of thing. And I always fancied doing this really huge book on horror movies and, you know, the A to Z of horror movies, which I sort of do now, because we have a horror guide in The Dark Side, which has been going for donkey's years. And I think that probably a big breakthrough came for me when the video industry took off in the late 70s, early 80s, because obviously what happened was a number of magazines sprung up to review the kind of movies that were coming out, and of course the infamous video nasties came along, which was, you know, my favourite period, I guess. You know, it enabled me to see all these movies like Driller Killer and Zombie Flesh Eaters Uncut and The Last House on the Left and all those kind of films, the really gory stuff. But the good thing about it was that you know, I knew a lot about the background of movies like The Last House on the Left and I Spit on Your Grave and Zombie Flesh Eaters, etc. And because of that, my articles that I would send to magazines were always published, you know, because people were starved of this kind of information, and the conventional film journalists who used to write for the more snooty magazines and newspapers didn't know a damn about this stuff. Darkside didn't come along actually until about 1990. That was when it was launched. And leading up to that, it's kind of interesting. I did a magazine for another company called Video X, and it was a company called Argus. And I remember going in to see the managing director. I used to do that under another name because it was kind of top shelf, sort of girly material. And I went in there and I was having a conversation with the managing director of Argus. And suddenly on his desk there's this magazine called Skeleton Crew, and I said to him, "What's that then? You know, what's that horror magazine? You know, because I couldn't believe it. You know, they were going to do a horror magazine." And he said, "Oh yes, we're doing a new horror magazine." And he said, "You don't know anything about horror films, do you?" I said, "Well, I would have loved to have done that." And I said, "Well, it's too late now, isn't it, really?" And he said, "Well, you might be able to write for it if you want to contact the editor or something." But not long after that, a publisher friend of mine who had worked at Argus had moved to another publishing company associated with Robert Maxwell. And he immediately said, "Well, first thing I'm going to do is create a competitor for this Skeleton Crew magazine." He said, "And I think you know, you should do it because you know about horror." And it's going to be called The Dark Side. Now this guy, Chris Adam Smith, who's, you know, a very good friend of mine to this day, he's the person who suggested the name The Dark Side, and I thought, I don't know. At the time, there was this series called Tales from the Dark Side. George Romero made it, and it was on all the time. And I thought, people might think it's affiliated with that, and I wasn't that crazy over the title. It had to be said, but then, you know, Chris had this designer whip up this sort of like horror round the world logo type thing and everything, and I thought, oh yeah, well that looks quite nice. It's a bit comic-y, but it looks quite nice. So I was kind of bamboozled into The Dark Side. I had all these other ideas of names I'd call it, but in retrospect, he was absolutely right, because I think The Dark Side is a terrific name for a magazine, and of course, a bit like The Twilight Zone. You know, The Twilight Zone kind of has come into public, you know, domain. People still use the phrase, "Oh, you know, I thought I was in the Twilight Zone," or something like that, even today. And with The Dark Side, of course, it's generally associated now probably with the Star Wars movies. But on the other hand, that's, you know, it's no bad thing that people remember the name, and it is a kind of distinctive name. I think my attitude is that, you know, to horror is that, you know, I like gore movies, but I also like the old-time movies as well, and I like to see. You know, the old Boris Karloff, Bela Lugosi movies. It's terrific that you're seeing a lot of those movies coming out in remastered special editions. I mean, I know the Horror Channel shows a lot of that stuff, you know, the Ghoul and you know, the classics, the old silent classics, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu, all that kind of material. And people, you know, if you're sort of like 10, 11-year-old kid, and, you know, you've stayed up late to watch this thing and it's given you the spooks, you're never quite going to get that same level of, it's never going to sort of grind itself into your consciousness as much when you're 15, 16, 17, you know, because, you know, particularly nowadays when kids are subjected to all kinds of, you know, sort of bombastic movies that, you know, probably would have been running, I think I'd have been running from the cinema at the Sound in Van Helsing if I'd seen it as a kid. But now kids are just inured to a different kind of filmmaking. But I think it's just nice to think that those movies, those Hammer movies, and a lot of the British horror movies like Witchfinder General, Blood on Satan's Claw, those kind of movies, now you can look at them and think, well, you know, they are actually pretty good movies. The modern day horror movie has actually done the same thing probably as the horror movie did years and years ago. You know, because horror as a genre is one of the most enduringly popular genres. You can understand why it's popular with filmmakers. It's not like you're making a war film or a western. You're not making Troy or anything like that where everyone's got to dress up in funny costumes and you've got to have, you know, 5 million CGI extras. You don't have to make a movie. You know, obviously Van Helsing's a bit of an anomaly, and The Mummy and all those kind of movies, they're $150 million horror movies. But in general, the horror movie has always been the saviour of the studios, because in the 30s it rescued Universal when their big budget movies were going belly up at the box office, and their Frankenstein movies rescued them. RKO were rescued by the Val Lewton movies, The Cat People and that sort of stuff. And this has happened all throughout time. If you look at this last year, two of the most popular, biggest money makers were the remakes of Dawn of the Dead and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Made a massive profit. I mean, when they tally up the box office on those against the box office from, say, a movie like Troy, but, you know, pretty successful movie, but nowhere near the amount of profit will be generated. And so, therefore, you can bet that, you know, the boogeymen of old will continue to be resurrected, you know, like the old House of Frankenstein movies from, you know, because that's the thing about horror. It's an adaptable genre, and kids will always love it, and grown-ups will always moan you know, it's a terrible thing for them to be interested in, that the one day they'll grow out of it. And I think, as I say, from my point of view, Dark Side is a magazine for people who've never grown out of it.